This is test number 5, following video number 5, cash versus accrual. Okay, let's just do a little overview. When we use the cash basis, we record the sales at the time we receive the payment. The same with the expense, we record the expense at the time that we make the payment. Very easy on cash. There's not really a whole lot to explain there. So if you have any questions, please leave me a comment or send me an email and I'll be happy to help you. The basis is chosen when you open your business, the basis that you're going to keep your books. That's something that you decide with your accountant, and sometimes there are some requirements, but we'll go over that later. Right now, I'd just like you to learn the difference between these two right here, okay? Accrual means that we record the sale when it's earned, and we record the expense when it is incurred, okay? So that means that we need to use accounts receivable and accounts payable. That way we can keep up with the amount that our customers owe us and the amount that we owe our vendors, okay? So when we create an invoice for our customers, that is called accounts receivable. And when we receive a bill from our vendor, which is an invoice, our vendor is giving us an invoice, but we call it a bill when we receive it, okay? That is accounts payable. All right, let's go ahead and move on with the test. That will give you a little bit of practice and some time to really let it sink in. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment or send me an email, okay? Here, let's go ahead and start with the cash test first. I want you to look at these problems and then just make a note of which date you would record the following transactions in your general ledger. And then notice down here I have what are the two accounts to use for each of these entries. Remember, each of those will have two sides. All right, so let me just go ahead and give you an example real quick. Work is completed on credit January 17th, 2017, and the customer made a cash payment on February 15th, 2017. So when would this be recorded in the general ledger, and what are the two sides of the entry? What are the two accounts that you would use? We're not using any dollar amounts, so just tell me what two accounts you would use for that entry. And do the same for all 4 of those problems. All right, stop the video, do that, come back, and we'll review the answers. Okay, here are your cash test answers. The first one, since the customer made the payment on February 15th and we're on the cash basis, we'll record the payment we'll record the entire transaction on February 15th. And the two accounts that we will use, the debit will be to cash because we've received cash. The credit will be to sales. The next one, a product was sold on credit January 2nd. The customer paid cash on February 3rd. So on the cash basis, we would record this transaction on February the 3rd. The debit would be to cash and the credit would be to sales. The next one is supplies were purchased on credit January the 12th. We paid the bill with cash on February 16th. So we'll record this transaction in the general ledger dated February 16th, and the two accounts that we'll post this transaction to will be a debit to supplies and a credit to cash. The next one is small tools were purchased on January 14th. We paid the bill with cash on February 13th. So again, we're going to record this transaction when we actually make the payment. February 13th will be the date. The two accounts will be a debit to supplies and a credit to cash. All right, I hope that's very clear. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you have questions, okay? Now let's go ahead and move on to the accrual test. Now, do the same thing here, except I want you to note that the first 4 are going to have 4 different accounts that you post to. There's going to be 2 accounts on the first part and 2 accounts for the second part, as just like we discussed in the video, okay? So you'll have that for the first 4, and then the last 2 will just have 2 accounts, okay? So give it your best shot and come back and let's go over the answers. Now let's go over our accrual test answers. So number 1, work is completed on credit January 17th. So that is the first part of our entry. So we come down here January 17th. We will have a debit to accounts receivable and a credit to sales. Because the work took place on January 17th, we earned it at that time. We extended credit to the customer, and they will pay us at a later date. So our transaction is a debit to accounts receivable and a credit to sales. That way we know how much money we have coming to us, and we also know how much we sold on that day. All right, so then the next part of this transaction, the payment was made on February 15th. So that goes here. The February 15th will be the date. We'll have a debit to cash because we have increased the amount of cash that we have now when we receive the payment. And then we reduce our accounts receivable, so a credit. The accounts receivable will receive a credit to reduce the amount in accounts receivable now, okay? So our next problem, a product was sold on credit January the 2nd. That's the first part of it. So January the 2nd will debit accounts receivable and credit sales. The second part of the problem is when the payment was made, we received the cash. That date is February the 3rd. Cash will receive a debit and accounts receivable a credit for whatever the dollar amounts are. We're not using dollar amounts. This is just for practice. All right, so the next transaction, supplies were purchased on credit January the 12th. That's the first part. So that date is January the 12th. That's when we actually received our supplies. Debit will go to supplies. Accounts payable will receive the credit. All right. Expenses are always a debit. Accounts payable is in the liability section because we owe that money, so it receives a credit. Now the second part to that transaction, we paid the bill on February 16th. So the date is February 16th. We're going to reduce the amount that we owe now. So accounts payable will receive a debit and cash will receive a credit because we're reducing the amount of cash that we have. All right, so the next transaction, small tools were purchased on credit January the 14th. So we are going to debit supplies and credit accounts payable. Then the payment was made on February 13th, so we debit accounts payable and credit cash. The next transaction, a product was sold and the customer paid cash at the time of sale on January 5th, 2017. So on this transaction, it's only going to require two entries, because this is not an accounts receivable. We are going to record a sales receipt or a sales transaction, and the date will be January 5th. The debit will go to cash and the credit to sales. You only use accounts receivable, of course, when you are extending credit to a customer. The same with this next transaction. Office supplies were purchased with cash on January the 10th, 2017. It only requires one transaction. We do not put it through accounts payable because it is not accounts payable. We are paying cash at the time of purchase. They did not extend us credit. So the date is January 10th, 2017. Our debit will be to office supplies and the credit will be posted to the cash account. I hope that this has been helpful. Please leave me a comment or send me an email if you have any questions. That covers our test number 5. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Please share the videos and subscribe. Thank you.